Fitzgerald, and I am part of the Southern Illinois University Behavior Analysis and Therapy program. Today I will be presenting to you an analysis of a multiple schedule of reinforcement producing differential responding in a fish. The following study provides an analysis of a domesticated freshwater fish's responding on a multiple schedule of reinforcement. Responding was measured through observation of swimming under an elevated post, or limbo training as I would call it, independently. Baseline data was collected prior to any manipulation of the reinforcement schedule. Multiple schedule of reinforcement was then implemented, where two schedules were alternated, each being correlated with its own stimulus. The schedules and correlated stimuli were alternated over the course of 8 sessions after baseline until differential responding was shown by the fish, as demonstrated by the limbo training compliance. These results, along with the implications and directions for the future research, will be discussed today in my presentation. The subject for my project today was one individual African cichlid who was a male, and the fish was used in both schedules of reinforcement of the study, measured approximately 1.5 inches long. When the fish was not being used in the experiment, it was housed in the same glass tank. However, there was artificial decor for the fish to use as shelter, which was removed during the experimentation procedures, obviously. The subject was housed with one other male African cichlid that was a little bit smaller in size, approximately 1 inch. For visual analysis on this tank, I do have a picture, or a video I should say, right under here. This video is shown from my previous target, where this is a separate subject, but it gives the same visual analysis of the tank itself, approximate size. As you can see, the hoop is actually in there from my last experiment, but you get the idea on the general setting of the tank itself. I did keep the tank at about 74 degrees Fahrenheit and kept it on a cycle with about 10 hours of natural light from a window each day, supplemented by an additional approximately about 1 hour of light per night. The fish had continuous access to the fresh water, but food was limited to once per day just for the treatment and experimentation sessions only. Here's another visual analysis of the apparatus that I used in my study. The top, once again, is a picture of the tank itself. The bottom is actually a picture of the limbo that I used. You can actually see the subject in there as well. He's a yellow Lepidochromis. About 5.5 gallons of fresh water in there, treated with typical chemicals just needed to maintain the fish's stability and health. The walls were bare other than the suction cup heater, which you can see on the bottom picture there to the right, and a thermometer, which is on the back left. And the limbo setup was anchored to the bottom with the R2 fish school materials. It's just a black base. And the feeding wand I don't have pictured right now. However, it's approximately a little less than 1/2 inch in diameter, about 12 inches long, green in color, and has a red compartment on the bottom, and a button at the top used to release the food under the contingencies that I provide. I did not take, actually you can see a picture now of the wand itself right there. I did not take any IOA data for this due to the fact that I was the only administrator of any reinforcement, any practitioner that had anything to do at all, basically, with the implementation. Right now what I'll do is I'll tell you about the procedure that we used. So each trial first began with isolating the fish into its own experimental environment, which basically consisted of moving all the decor, the fake pineapple, plants, anything else from the tank itself, just leave an empty bare tank with just the essentials to live in there. However, I did have to keep his tank mate in there, which is that 1 inch African cichlid as well. The limbo apparatus was then placed into the bottom of the tank, right in the center. Process was repeated for every single session that we did, and no attempt was made to train the response for swimming into the target. The experimenter was oriented on the same side of the tank as it was on a counter in the same position for each trial. Each session was set at a time limit for 4 total minutes, which is broken down into a 4-minute session of fixed ratio and fixed interval of 10 seconds. The fixed ratio was of 1. So baseline data was taken over the course of 4 sessions, each mimicking the amount of time used in the intervention periods. So each component occurred twice per session, alternating order each trial. For instance, say first trial would be FR schedule for 1 minute, and then FI, FR, FI, and that would end the session. This was then switched so that the next session would then go FI, FR, FI, FR. That way to keep the randomization a little bit better. Each component occurred twice, and positive reinforcement was provided for the successful trials under the schedule via the feeding wad, given 3 fish pellets per reward. The schedule correlated stimuli were presented to signal which schedule the fish was to be operating under to receive the reinforcement at the time. The purpose of this condition was to determine if correlating stimuli with the availability and unavailability of food was sufficient to acquire control over their responding. Prior to intervention, baseline data was taken. The scoring was performed by adding the results of both trials of separate stimuli per session. For instance, since we had 2 trials of FR and 2 trials of fixed interval, would add those up and come up with a total for the session. Here is an example of my baseline phase. I believe this was trial number 3 in baseline. So what I did, you can see the red light. It actually reflects on the tank right there underneath. And what I did, I observed, so you will see with the red light right now what we're doing is we're operating under a fixed ratio schedule. So I observed for 1 full minute and provided reinforcement for any time the fish actually swam through the limbo apparatus itself. This will be approximately a 4-minute video, so it's going to take up a chunk of my presentation, but you can also see the tank mate in there, which we'll talk about later. He did tend to swim around the limbo apparatus occasionally. There we go. As you can see, no reinforcement was given in the baseline phase. Sorry, I did mention that wrong earlier. We would count, so that would have been 1 I observed so far going through. As you can see, he's not actually completing swimming through yet. As you can see, he did not swim through, so he had 1 successful. As you can see now, I switched it over to the green light, and my timer also began for 1 minute. As you can see, that was a nice quick trial there. Switching of the lights again. So now we are back on the fixed ratio schedule with the red light. I apologize, in the video for some reason the light looks very white. However, I can assure you in person it definitely had more of a red tint or hue to it. So as you can see, we are now on trial 3 of the session, which repeats the stimuli used in the first trial. And the fish is relatively energetic, especially considering my previous subjects that I had to use in other targets. I'm not too sure because they're smaller or younger versions of the same species, that they just have more energy, but definitely much more compliant than my previous targets. And now you can see we are on the final stage, which is back to the fixed interval in the 4th trial of this session. There's a nice successful trial right there. As you can see, you do have to pay pretty good attention to the subject itself. There's no being lazy when you're observing them, just because sometimes it may appear that they swim under the limbo post. However, if your perspective is a little off, they could be swimming on the opposite end of the tank, just like that, or the closest to you. As Trying to make sure they are swimming directly through. That's why it's nice to have a little bit of an angle. Oh, that was a close one. He did seem to get a little distracted at times. And that will be the end of that session for baseline. In this video here will be the treatment implementation itself. As you can see, we started, okay, so coincidentally, this one actually started as well with the fixed ratio responding. So it's indicated by the red light. This is trial 8. So this was approximately 3/4, I would say. I don't have an exact number in mind, but 3/4, maybe even halfway through our implementation. So as you can see, when we're on the fixed ratio, we will get, see, he went through the hoop. FR, so the fixed ratio, he swam through once, so he has met the criteria for reward. The timer continues also, by the way. Definitely a very tedious task, especially making sure that you have the feeding wand ready and prepped for the next trial. Just don't know how immediately it's going to happen after the first one. Now switching schedules to the fixed intervals. So these were 10 seconds intervals completed within the 1-minute trial. So you can see he swam around there. Around again. So that was a successful trial there, so I needed to wait until the 10-second interval completed and then provide the reward, or the reinforcement, I should say. 10 seconds did seem a little soon. I do wish I changed it to 20 seconds, but we'll talk about that later. And now switching after that one full 1-minute interval back to fixed ratio, which is signaled by the red light, and immediately had a response. As you can see, sometimes the food will have residual that stays along the top of the water. There was a successful trial, fixed ratio, right at the end of the trial. And back to the final phase of this session, which is fixed interval. So back to the 10 seconds fixed interval over the course of a 1-minute trial. As you can see in my reflection there, actually I didn't realize my reflection was in the video, but you can kind of see how preparing the wand, making sure to stay on task with the schedule implementation itself. Watching the timer, I did have a timer right behind the phone actually, which I was recording with. And that will be the end of this session. So as you can see with the results, what we actually just went over was baseline trial 3, where on the fixed ratio we had a responding of, I believe it was 2, and on the fixed interval I actually had responding of 4 trials that were successful. And as you can see then in 8, where the implementation is, those levels have elevated in fixed ratio. And on that trial, actually, it seemed to remain a little bit lower for the fixed interval. So during the baseline and treatment implementations, those two separate colors of LED light were used as the discriminative stimulus. Data was recorded with the response rate averaging 1.25 responses per session under the implementation of the red light and 1.5 responses per session under the implementation of the green light for my fixed interval. Trials were continued after baseline for that additional 8 sessions until the behavior reached a steady high rate of responding under the one schedule, which in this case you can see is fixed rate, which is typical that fixed rate has a high and consistent rate of responding. The results of the treatment study show that responding was increased and about 4.9 times over baseline, which is pretty impressive. When the multiple schedule was arranged, response increased during the FR components, but also persisted during the components for the FI schedule implementation. As expected, as I hypothesized myself, fixed ratio responding did produce a higher steady rate of responding, and fixed interval did show some sort of increase over baseline as far as averages. However, it did produce a lower level of responding. All right, as far as my discussion for this, the first thing I'm going to jump straight into is the confounds or kind of barriers that I hit with this. So one thing that I did realize once I did implementation was the 10 seconds in the fixed interval was very, very soon. So it was very, very similar to the FR schedule because it would only be a slight delay in reinforcement. I wish I did do a little bit longer, even if I did do the 1-minute sessions, if I did 20 seconds. That's just one thing. The other thing was with the food being used as the tangible reinforcer itself, left a lot of residue on top of the water itself, or if the fish didn't respond immediately and eat that, it would distract them, I feel like, so that they didn't have basically the chance to swim back through the hoop. There was no reason for them to go back through underneath the limbo post, I should say, just because they were either distracted by the food or there was no reason for them to swim under there because they still had food waiting for them at the top. So maybe next time what I would do is just use one fish pellet. Also, the extra fish in the tank mate. I didn't have another place to house this fish. This is something I would take into consideration in the future. So maybe next time what I would do is separate him from the tank because A, I did notice he was going after the reinforcers as well when it was given to my fish that was responding. And B, I just wasn't too sure if there was a following interference or anything like that, if the fishes were responding to each other's behavior. And that's just something I'd take into effect in the future. It does show how the fish in the study demonstrate a high rate of responding among various stimuli. And not only they can display the learned behavior, but that the thicker reinforcement schedule was implemented successfully and with results that are similar to another study that I actually read up on by Wirth, et al. And Hako. They did a similar study with beta fish. This study examined the fish's behavior in comparisons with the two schedules that were alternated, however, both working together to increase the overall responding rate. Cichlids' response to varied stimuli successfully increased the target response. I would also consider my own error in my discussion here as well for any distraction type behavior shown by the fish, such as myself being next to the tank. As you can see, my reflection was in it. I wonder if I did conduct this experiment in the dark, possibly, with just the SD being present and no residual light so that you can see what was outside the tank. But however, overall, this was a successful experiment, and thank you for your time.